The sun beat down on the desert sands, casting long shadows over the battlefield of Uwjd. Amid the clashing swords and shouts of warriors, a name echoed in the chaos: Khalid ibn al-Walid. He wasn't a Muslim yet. At that moment in time, he stood on the side of the Quraysh, the staunch enemies of Prophet Muhammad (PBUH). The Muslims had initially taken control of the battlefield, their spirits lifted by an early victory. But Khalid, a master of battlefield strategy even in his youth, saw an opening that others missed. From behind the hill, he noticed the archers had left their post, believing the battle was won. That was his moment. Like a lion stalking his prey, he led his cavalry around the mountain, striking the Muslim ranks from behind. Confusion spread. Muslims caught between two fronts were thrown into disorder. Many brave companions were martyred. Even the Prophet PBUH himself was injured, and rumors of his death began to spread. It was a day of heavy trial for the believers, and a moment of triumph for Khalid. Yet, deep inside Khalid's heart a seed had been planted. He had fought with all his might, but he couldn't ignore the courage, discipline, and faith of the Muslims, even in the face of chaos. He watched their resilience, their unwillingness to abandon their prophet, even when they believed he had died. That sight stayed with him. Time passed. The Quraysh returned to Mecca, but the victories of the Muslims continued to grow. The Hudaybiyah Treaty brought a pause to the fighting, and with that pause came time for reflection. Khalid began to question his path. He had fought against this man, Muhammad PBUH, not once but twice. He had seen the strength of Islam with his own eyes. What made these Muslims so fearless? What gave them such unshakable unity and peace? He asked himself again and again, was it possible that he had been wrong? It was during this period that his heart began to soften. His brother, who had already embraced Islam, sent him a message filled with warmth and sincerity. A man of your wisdom and strength should not be deprived of the truth, the letter read. Khalid pondered those words for days. They struck a chord deep within him. Then he made a decision that would change the course of history. He packed his belongings and journeyed to Medina, not as an enemy this time, but as a seeker of truth. As he entered the Prophet's mosque, his steps slowed. The companions stood in awe. Here was the warrior who had once caused them such grief. But the Prophet PBUH, with a heart full of mercy, stood up to greet him. Khalid's voice trembled. I have come to bear witness that there is no God but Allah, and that you are His messenger. The Prophet smiled and said, all your past is forgiven, Khalid. At that moment, Khalid felt a weight lift from his heart. He was no longer a sword of Quraysh. He was now the sword of Allah, ready to serve the truth he had once tried to destroy. His story reminds us that even the fiercest of opponents can become the strongest of allies when truth touches the heart. The desert winds carried whispers of change, and in the silence of the night, Khalid ibn al-Walid sat alone outside Mecca. The stars above shimmered, but his heart was in turmoil. The battles he had fought against the Muslims played over and over in his mind, not just the strategy and the swordplay, but the courage of the people he had tried to defeat. They had something he couldn't explain, something unshakable. It wasn't wealth, it wasn't numbers, it was something deeper. Khalid, once the pride of the Quraysh military, felt an emptiness growing in his soul. It was as though every victory he once took pride in now carried the weight of a lie. Then a message came, a letter from his brother who had embraced Islam. It was not a command or a demand, but an invitation. O Khalid, it said, a man of your wisdom should not remain blind to the truth. The Prophet asks about you. He misses you. Come to him. That one line struck his heart more deeply than any blade ever could. The Prophet Muhammad PBUH had asked about him. Despite everything Khalid had done, the Prophet had hoped for him. Something stirred within him. Perhaps it was guilt, perhaps it was longing, perhaps it was the divine light finally finding a crack in his pride. The next day, Khalid made his decision. He would travel to Medina, not as a warrior, not as a general, but as a man in search of forgiveness, of truth, of peace. He didn't go alone. Alongside him was Amr ibn al-As, another noble who had also been shaken by the growing strength and justice of Islam. Together they rode through the dry lands toward the Prophet's city. As they approached Medina, Khalid felt nervousness creeping into his chest. Would he be welcomed? Would the Muslims forgive him? Would the Prophet accept him after all the harm he had caused? When they arrived, the companions gathered in curiosity. They knew the face of Khalid ibn al-Walid well. Many had lost family to his sword, and yet there he stood, tall, proud, but humbled, waiting for permission to enter. Then the Prophet PBUH appeared, his face calm and full of light. Khalid walked forward slowly and placed his hand in the Prophet's. "I testify there is no God but Allah, and you are his messenger," he said, voice heavy with emotion. The Prophet PBUH looked into his eyes and said, "Praise be to Allah, who guided you, Khalid. I knew that a mind like yours would one day find the truth." Tears filled Khalid's eyes. He couldn't believe the grace he had been shown. He asked, "Will all that I have done be forgiven?" And the Prophet replied, "Islam erases everything before it." In that moment, Khalid ibn al-Walid was reborn. The sword that once opposed the truth now belonged to it. He would go on to become its most loyal defender, never turning back. His heart had changed, and with it, the future of the Muslim Ummah. The sun blazed high above the land of Mu'tah as dust swirled on the horizon. An army of 30,000 Roman soldiers, armored and organized, stood like an immovable mountain across the battlefield. Opposing them stood just 3,000 Muslims, exhausted, far from home, but filled with resolve. Among them was Khalid ibn al-Walid, a new Muslim, not yet battle-tested under the banner of Islam. The Prophet Muhammad PBUH had appointed 3 commanders in order: Zayd ibn Haritha, Jafar ibn Abi Talib, and Abdullah ibn Rawaha. Khalid was not on that list. His role was to fight, not to lead. But what unfolded that day would mark the turning point of his life. The battle began with Zayd leading the charge, his standard held high. He fought valiantly, but the Roman blades struck him down. Then Jafar took the banner, his sword flashing as he cut through the enemy ranks. He lost one arm, then the other, but still clutched the banner with what strength remained until he too was martyred. Finally, Abdullah ibn Raha stepped forward. His steps were heavy, but his heart was firm. He too fell on the battlefield. 3 commanders, 3 heroes gone in a single day. Panic rippled through the Muslim ranks. Confusion threatened to break their lines. Who would lead now? Who could face such a mighty enemy? Eyes turned to Khalid ibn al-Walid, the man who had once fought against Islam, now being looked upon to save its army. With no time to hesitate, Khalid picked up the banner. He surveyed the field, reading the enemy's movements like a seasoned book. The Muslims were surrounded and outmatched, but Khalid's mind moved with divine clarity. He didn't just fight, he transformed the battlefield. He divided the Muslim army into smaller units and began rotating the flanks, giving the illusion of fresh reinforcements. He changed banners, swapped positions, and unleashed attacks from unexpected angles. The Romans began to believe that the Muslims had received reinforcements. Doubt spread in their ranks. Then came Khalid's final maneuver, a skillful withdrawal. Not a retreat of defeat, but a strategic exit that saved the lives of thousands. He led the Muslims out of the enemy's grasp without letting them be crushed. No one had ever witnessed such battlefield brilliance before. When news of the battle reached Medina, some criticized the withdrawal, but the Prophet PBUH raised his hand and said, "No, they did not flee. They returned by Allah's permission." And he gave Khalid a title that would remain with him forever, Saifullah, the sword of Allah. From that moment on, Khalid was not just a commander, he was the chosen sword of divine will. He had not only protected the Muslims, but had brought them honor in the face of overwhelming odds. The heart that once opposed Islam had now become its sharpest weapon, not with arrogance, but with complete submission to Allah. The battlefield of Yarmouk stretched wide and dusty, the horizon blurred by heat and tension. It was one of the most critical moments in the early days of the Islamic Ummah. After the death of Prophet Muhammad PBUH, chaos had spread across the Arabian Peninsula. Tribes were rebelling, refusing to pay zakat, and false prophets had risen, claiming divine revelations. Among them, the most dangerous was Musaylima al-Kadhab, Musaylima the liar, who had amassed a massive army in the region of Yamama and declared himself a prophet. His followers were fanatical, his army well-trained, and his threat deadly. Caliph Abu Bakr, wise and determined to protect the unity of Islam, sent one of his most trusted warriors to lead the Muslim army, Khalid ibn al-Walid, the sword of Allah. This would not be an easy fight. The enemy was not just militarily strong, but ideologically dangerous. It was a war to protect the very soul of Islam. As Khalid rode across the battlefield, his sharp eyes assessed the terrain. He saw the discipline of Musaylima's forces. These were not merely rebellious tribesmen, they were organized and ready to kill or die for their leader. The Muslim forces, though filled with faith, were anxious. Among them were many companions of the Prophet PBUH, brave but shaken by the size and fury of the opposing army. The battle began with intensity. Arrows darkened the sky, swords clashed, and cries of Allahu Akbar echoed against the cries of Musaylima's deluded followers. The Muslims faced heavy resistance, and at one point their lines began to break. The situation turned desperate. Blood stained the sand. Even seasoned warriors fell. Khalid, seeing the chaos, acted swiftly. He reorganized the ranks, placed seasoned fighters at the front, and reignited their spirits with powerful words. "Do you not remember the days of Badr? Do you not remember fighting by the side of the Prophet himself?" he roared. His voice struck hearts like lightning. He led from the front, fearless, unstoppable, his sword flashing like thunder through the storm of battle. Then, in a crucial moment, Khalid ordered a direct attack toward Musaylima himself, who had taken refuge in a garden fortified by high walls. This garden would later be known as Hadiqat al-Maut, the Garden of Death. The fighting was brutal. Many Hufaz, those who had memorized the Quran, were martyred that day, their blood watering the soil of Islam's survival. Eventually, through sheer courage and unwavering resolve, the Muslims breached the garden. Washi ibn Harb, the same man who had once killed Hamza Ra in Uhud but had since embraced Islam, threw a spear that struck Musaylima down. With his death, the battle turned in the Muslims' favor. Victory was hard-earned, but complete. The cost was heavy. 70 companions who had memorized the Quran were martyred, prompting Abu Bakr to later initiate the collection of the Quran into a single book. But had Khalid not led the Muslims that day, had his sword not cut through doubt and fear, the tide could have turned and the unity of Islam could have shattered. The Battle of Yarmouk was not just a military victory, it was a test of faith, of leadership, and of sacrifice. And Khalid ibn al-Walid once again proved why he was the chosen sword of Allah. The wind howled over the plains of Yarmouk, carrying with it the dust of 1,000 feet and the tension of an empire on the edge. It was the year 636 CE. The mighty Byzantine Empire, with a force numbering over 200,000, stood ready to crush the Muslims once and for all. Their army was vast, disciplined, and heavily equipped. Facing them was a Muslim force of barely 40,000, outnumbered, outmatched in armor, but led by a man whose name alone sent fear through the hearts of enemies, Khalid ibn al-Walid, the sword of Allah. The Byzantine emperor had called warriors from all across his territories: Greeks, Armenians, Slavs, and Christian Arabs. This was not just a battle, it was a final stand to push back the wave of Islam spreading rapidly through Syria and the Levant. The Muslims, despite being fewer in number, were united by faith and by the leadership of Khalid, who had by now become legendary for never losing a battle. As the two armies faced each other, Khalid walked through the ranks of his men, his voice calm but commanding. He reminded them not of the size of the enemy, but of the size of their trust in Allah. Victory does not come from numbers, he said, but from the heart that fears nothing but Allah. His words struck deep. His men stood straighter, eyes fixed on the horizon. Then the battle began. It raged for days, 6 full days of blood, dust, and fire. The Byzantines launched wave after wave of cavalry, pressing hard against the Muslim lines. But every time they surged forward, Khalid would adjust his strategy. He moved his troops like pieces on a chessboard, replacing tired units with fresh ones, shifting the center, reinforcing the flanks. His understanding of terrain, timing, and morale turned the chaos of war into a symphony of precision. On the 3rd day, the Byzantines managed to push deep into the Muslim lines. Panic threatened to spread, but Khalid, always at the heart of the danger, galloped into the thickest fighting. His sword blazed as he called his men back to order. "To the death," he cried, and his presence turned fear into fury. The Muslims counterattacked with such intensity that the Byzantines were thrown back. On the final day, Khalid prepared a trap. He created a narrow corridor by placing cavalry on both sides, then feigned a retreat. The Byzantines pursued, believing they had won. But as they entered the corridor, Khalid's cavalry struck from both sides, crushing them in a pincer movement. The Byzantine army crumbled, its soldiers fleeing, drowning in the nearby Yarmouk River or falling to Muslim swords. By sunset, the battlefield was silent, except for the cries of victory from the Muslim ranks. The Battle of Yarmouk was over, and the greatest military force in the world had been defeated by faith, strategy, and the unbreakable leadership of Khalid ibn al-Walid. This battle changed the course of history. Syria opened to Islam. The Byzantine Empire was forever weakened in the region, and the name of Khalid ibn al-Walid was etched deeper into the story of Islam, not just as a warrior, but as a divine instrument of justice and strength. His sword, though wielded by human hands, had struck with the power of belief. The sun rose over the ancient lands of Persia, casting its golden hue on the battlefield of Wallajah. The Persian Empire, rich in glory and arrogance, had sent a massive force to crush the advancing Muslims. Their generals were confident. They had the numbers, the weapons, and centuries of war experience on their side. The Muslim army, much smaller, had come not for land or riches, but to spread the message of truth. At their front stood a man whose presence electrified the desert air: Khalid ibn al-Walid, the sword of Allah. Khalid knew this battle was unlike any other. The Persians were not just defending territory, they were defending an empire. Their elite warriors, lined up in perfect formations, archers ready, cavalry positioned to face them head-on, would be suicide. But Khalid was not just a swordsman, He was a master of battlefield psychology. He had studied the terrain, the behavior of the enemy, and the flow of war itself. Before the first arrow flew, Khalid had already decided his plan. He would use a tactic so brilliant that historians would later compare it to the legendary strategies of Hannibal and Alexander. He arranged his army in a way that appeared straightforward, but he had secretly placed 2 strong cavalry units behind nearby hills, hidden from view. The Persians didn't suspect a thing. The battle began with a fierce clash. The Muslims fought with heart-chanting verses of Quran as they held their ground. The Persians, with their massive numbers, began to push forward, believing victory was near. The Muslim center bent under pressure exactly as Khalid had planned. He was pretending to retreat, luring the Persian army deeper into a trap. When the Persians were fully committed and the battlefield had shifted in Khalid's favor, he gave the signal. From behind the hills, like bolts of lightning, the hidden Muslim cavalry surged forth, crashing into the Persian flanks from both sides. Panic erupted in the enemy ranks. The proud Persian army was now surrounded, their formation broken, their confidence shattered. Khalid led the charge himself, his sword cleaving through armor and fear alike. The Muslims, energized by the sudden reversal, fought with renewed passion. The Persians tried to regroup, but it was too late. They were caught in a deadly circle, with no path to retreat. By the end of the day, the battlefield was littered with broken weapons and defeated warriors. The mighty Persian army had been annihilated by a smaller force through faith, courage, and unmatched military genius. It was a victory that stunned the region. The Battle of Walaja was not just a tactical masterpiece, it was a declaration. The message of Islam was unstoppable, and no empire, no matter how ancient or powerful, could stand against a people led by truth and guided by a commander like Khalid ibn al-Walid. His name was now feared and respected across the known world. Yet Khalid sought no crown, no treasure, only the pleasure of Allah and the honor of serving his deen. The sun dipped low in the sky as Khalid ibn al-Walid stood quietly near his tent. News had just arrived. A letter from the new Caliph, Umar ibn al-Khattab. Its words were brief, but heavy. You are hereby relieved of your command. For most men, such a message would have been a humiliation. For the undefeated commander who had never lost a single battle, who had broken the backs of both the Roman and Persian empires, it could have been seen as a betrayal. But Khalid was not most men. He read the letter again, slower this time. There was no anger in his eyes, no bitterness in his heart. Instead, there was peace. He folded the letter gently and looked up at the sky. He understood Umar's decision. Umar feared that people were beginning to place their trust in Khalid more than in Allah, that they saw victory not as a blessing from above, but as a result of Khalid's unmatched military genius. Umar, with his deep sense of tawheed and justice, wanted to restore the people's focus. It wasn't Khalid who brought victory, it was always Allah. Khalid didn't argue, he didn't send word back to question the Caliph's choice, he didn't try to defend his record or demand recognition. Instead, he gathered his soldiers and stood before them with calm dignity. I fought not for Umar, he told them, but for Allah. If Umar removes me, then I accept it. My sword will remain in the path of truth. There was silence among the men. Some were shocked, others saddened. Many had followed Khalid through the most brutal of battles, trusting his leadership with their lives. But here was their commander, stepping down without a fight, without protest. His submission wasn't weakness. It was strength of a different kind. The strength of a heart that placed no value on worldly titles or power. After his removal, Khalid remained in the army, now as a soldier under new commanders, men far less experienced than he was. Yet he obeyed without hesitation, offering advice when asked, fighting with the same courage as always. Not once did he try to overshadow his new leaders. He humbled himself because he knew that service to Allah does not require a title, it requires sincerity. Umar, despite removing him, never stopped loving him. In fact, he wept deeply at Khalid's funeral and admitted that it had pained him to take the decision. But he did it for the sake of the Ummah, and Khalid accepted it for the same reason. In that quiet surrender, Khalid ibn al-Walid displayed a victory greater than any he had won with his sword. He showed the world that the sword of Allah was not only sharp in battle, but also polished with humility, submission, and trust in Allah's plan. The tent was silent. Its only sound, the slow, labored breathing of a warrior nearing the end of his journey. Khalid ibn al-Walid lay upon a simple bed, no banners, no swords, no thunder of battle. His body, once a storm on the battlefield, was now still. Yet beneath the worn skin and aching bones was a soul heavy with memories. Scars covered him from head to toe, each one a mark of bravery, each one a tale of faith, of danger, of conquest. And yet his heart ached not from pain, but from something deeper. He had fought in over 100 battles, had never lost even once, had broken the strongest armies on earth. But now, as he stared at the wooden beams above him, a sorrow filled his chest. He turned to his companion and said, in a voice cracked by time, "I have fought in so many battles. There is not a span on my body that does not carry the mark of a sword, a spear, or an arrow. And yet, here I die on my bed, like a camel." His eyes welled with tears, not of fear, but of longing. Longing for martyrdom, that sacred death he had pursued all his life. Riding into battle with no fear, with only the desire to give his life for Allah. But Allah had willed something else. Khalid was not meant to die on a battlefield. Though he had rushed into the fire of war again and again, though he had faced enemies 10 times his number, though he had shattered empires with the strength of his sword and the power of his trust in Allah, martyrdom had been held back from him. Perhaps because Allah wished for him to be a sign, a living proof that victory is not always tied to death, that serving Islam sometimes means living on, witnessing, teaching, and submitting to divine decree, even when the heart desires otherwise. Those around him sat in silence, humbled by his words. They knew they were in the presence of a man unlike any other, a man who had walked through fire, who had never backed down, but who now accepted death without bitterness. He had no gold, no palace, no worldly riches. He left behind no legacy of wealth, only stories of unmatched courage, of deep faith, and of unwavering loyalty to Allah and His Messenger. His only treasure was his reputation as the undefeated commander, the man who never sought fame, who never fought for glory, but who was always ready to die for what he believed in. As his breathing slowed and his eyes closed, Khalid ibn al-Walid returned to his Lord, not as a king, not as a general, but as a servant who had given his life to the cause of Islam, not in death, but in every heartbeat, every sword swing, every command shouted on the battlefield. His legacy would live on, etched not only into the history books, but into the hearts of believers who would, for generations, whisper his name with awe. Khalid ibn al-Walid, the sword of Allah, who died on his bed, undefeated, unshaken, and unforgettable.